Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Max Krasnow. He is Associate Professor in the Department of Psychology at Harvard University. His primary line of research focuses on the evolutionary origins and computational design of the mechanisms underlying human cooperation and social behavior. Why are we generous, trusting, and cooperative, but also vengeful and punitive than an otherwise rational analysis would predict? So that's the main question he tries to answer, and he has been exploring how the answers to these questions neatly fall out by considering reliable features of the ancestral ecology and simple cognitive mechanisms that could evolve to benefit from them. So, Dr. Krasnow, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Okay, great. So, the question that I included in the introduction perhaps is the one that will orient most of our conversation today, I guess. So, let me first ask you, why are we so generous, trusting, and cooperative? Where do those three traits and perhaps other positive ones from our sociality come from?
It's a great question. It tends to be something that people have an easy time being confused about, especially when you think about how traits evolve by a process of natural selection. We tend to have an easier time imagining how traits that are competitive with each other evolve. So a trait like weaponry, teeth, claws, growing large so that you can dominate your rivals, we have an easy time seeing how those would spread by a process of natural selection because they get more resources than their competitors. Social evolution is a little bit different. With social evolution, traits arise by a process of natural selection, not because they're doing better than the organisms that they're interacting with. Rather, they're getting benefits that less social organisms don't have access to. And so the question for social evolution, someone studying social evolution to answer is, what are the mechanisms that allow that kind of competitive advantage to accrue? When you look at a species like human, it turns out there's lots of answers. There are lots of pathways that organisms can actually yield benefits through different kinds of cooperative actions, as long as you can figure out how to do it, as long as the mechanism can figure out how to do it. And so we see, for example, in the human lineage, if you compare humans to non-human primates, we're different in a lot of ways, but we're similar in many, many ways. Some of the ways that we're different in terms of our social relationships is that we specialize our labor and activity. So, for example, if you look at the period of childhood in human versus the period of childhood in other great apes, we take a longer time to develop. That's a longer amount of time that we can spend learning specialized skills, learning how to do things better. And if you specialize in one thing and I specialize in something else, that makes the gains in trade that we could experience between us if we exchange those resources even more valuable. And so it turns out that if you think about the universe of possibilities, of all of the possible ways that you could get gains in trade, all of the possible ways that you could gain from a social ecology where, as an individual, you experience risk. Like if you're only going out by yourself and the only way that you're going to get food is by the virtue of your own success, you're exposed to a lot of risk in your environment. But if you could buffer that risk by sharing with others, where they help you when you're in need and you help them when they're in need, you both end up surviving your misfortunes. And so it turns out that the answers to a lot of these questions of how does a cooperative mechanism get selected by natural selection is that it finds ways of extracting benefits from the world that a non-cooperative mechanism misses out on.
Mm-hmm. For us to understand why particular kinds of traits evolved, we have to take into account the several different types of trade-offs that an organism in this case has to make, right? Because
of course,
if we evolved in different, for example, ecological conditions that didn't favor, for example, the kind of sociality that we have, we could probably be solitary animals and be more successful that way than by
Of
being
course,
highly cooperative and highly trusting and generous and so on and so forth. Right.
that's right. There's nothing particularly privileged about cooperation. Cooperation is just a good strategy for a certain kind of ecological circumstance.
Mm-hmm.
And you can think about circumstances that are stationary. So there are certain features so we have, for example, adaptations in our visual system that are calibrated to certain features of the world, like the fact that the spectrum of light that we experience is a little bit different. It's shifted in color spectrum space between the morning hours, the noon hours, and the evening hours. We expect, our brains expect light to be shifting into the red spectrum as the sun is setting. That's a stable feature regardless of, it was a stable feature across almost all of organismic evolution on this planet. Of course, as humans get technologically advanced enough, we might be able to do something about that, or accidentally do something about that. But if you think instead about the kinds of ecological circumstances that cooperation is indexed to, those are circumstances that are under much more finicky control over our behavior, or of our behavior. So for example, if the world is full of other individuals that don't specialize their labor, then I don't experience a world where there's many gains in trade to be had. But if just by a process of noise or mutation or some other kind of stochastic process, there becomes opportunities for larger gains in trade, that increases the payoff to trusting, to leveraging your way into cooperative relationships, because the possibility of getting that gain in trade is lucrative. Now, in a world where others are a little bit more trusting, that opens up the potential for gains in trade to be to specializing and exchanging your specialized resources to being a more profitable strategy. And so you can see there could be a positive feedback loop between these two features, where you can think of them as ecological features. As an organism, other people's trust and other people's degree of specialized resources are not under your control. It's part of your external environment. But by virtue of natural selection happening over time, that environment is changing along with the organism. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Another thing that I wanted to pick up on in your question is that it's certainly the case that there are some environments where, some ecological circumstances, where cooperation, trust, generosity is not the payoff maximizing strategy. You could look at closely related species to human and see that diversity of ecological circumstance. There's not that many millions of years of divergence between, for example, a social species like human or chimpanzee and a much less social species like orangutan, right? But we don't even have to look at that degree of separation to see that divergence of behavioral strategy. There are circumstances across recent human ancestry where there wasn't many gains in trade to be had. Our technology wasn't such that we had that much potential to specialize. Life was not safe enough to count on living for that long, so the shadow of the future was not so present. And so if you imagine what kinds of mechanisms we have in our head that are designed by natural selection to exploit the social ecology for benefit, we should expect that they have certain degrees of plasticity, that they're sensitive to cues in the environment that index, or at least indexed over evolutionary time, the likelihood that cooperation would pay off, the profitability of cooperation when it paid off, etc.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I mean, these psychological traits that we have exist due to natural selection, but when we talk about natural selection, it isn't just one single thing, right? We have sexual selection, what some people call social selection. Like, for example, earlier this year I had on the show Dr. Wrangham, who just published the book The Goodness Paradox, and he talks there a lot about social selection, that is, people punishing, or even in the extreme case killing, people that were non-cooperative during our evolutionary history, and that was one of the main drivers of our self-domestication process, let's say. So in this case of the evolution of these kinds of traits, where do you position things like sexual selection and social selection? Do you take them into account as well?
So I think that you have to take them into account, but I would offer an alternative way of thinking about how these concepts relate to each other.
Okay.
The way that I find it most helpful is to consider social selection and sexual selection to be particular instances of natural selection. Mm. So sexual selection is merely a application of thinking about natural selection when certain conditions hold. And social selection is an application of thinking about natural selection when different conditions hold. And so I wouldn't contrast them to an approach that is situating the crucible of adaptation in natural selection. I would just say they're potentially different selection pressures. Mm-hmm. And those aren't exhaustive of the full space of selection pressures. So, for example, within the domain of sexual selection, there are pressures that cause coevolutionary arms races between, for example, adaptations in one sex and adaptations in the other sex. And that arms race pressure happens within sexual selection, for example, like the peacock's tail. Peahens have a fitness interest in the genetic quality of the male's gametes that they're allowing to inseminate their eggs that they, as females, invest in higher than the males invest in their gametes. Males thus have an interest in broadcasting a signal of genetic quality that peahens can use. By virtue of that signal being broadcast at a certain level, that allows selection to choose to prefer the choosiest females, which then puts pressure on males to display more, which then puts pressure on females to be choosier, and males to display more, and this coevolutionary process ratchets up over time. Now, we often think about coevolution in the case of sexual selection first, but these kinds of coevolutionary processes don't just happen in the case of sexual selection. They happen in the case of lots of different areas of natural selection. Whenever there's not perfectly overlapping interests between two parties, and adaptations can occur in one sex that exerts a counter pressure on the, or not one sex, one adaptation exerts pressure on another adaptation that thus creates a positive feedback loop on the evolution of them both. Mm-hmm. So you can think of coevolution between trust and specialization in a similar coevolutionary way to thinking about choosiness and display in the case of the peacock. One, some people might call sexual selection. The other, some people might call social evolution. I would call them both natural selection.
Okay, so you would include all of these different processes of selection under the rubric, or would classify them under the rubric of natural selection, correct?
That's my view.
Mm-hmm. And let me just ask you this, because whenever we talk about cooperation or altruism, particularly in the context of biology or evolutionary theory, there are people that propose that certain of these traits, certain particular traits, have evolved due to group selection. Do you have any views on these? Like, for example, the fact that people like David Sloan Wilson and even recently E.O. Wilson and others say that there are altruistic behaviors and some aspects of what some people call strong reciprocity that they say we can only explain through not cultural but group selection in this case. Do you have any views on that or not?
I do. So I want to say, to frame what I'm going to say next, that there's no debate over the conceptual coherence of the group selection model. In fact, most theorists would agree that a multi-level selection model is the most coherent way of thinking about natural selection. There are many ways in which there can be covariance between different levels of organization of replicating elements and the structures that cause the fitness of those replicating elements to be covariant. You can think of an individual as a certain level of grouping, a family as another level of grouping, a social group as another level of grouping, a hive or a colony or a superorganism as some other level of grouping. So that's not where the disagreements happen.
Okay.
The disagreements tend to happen when we're looking at a particular behavior and we're asking which of two alternative hypotheses makes the most sense of that behavior. If we see a trait, for example, a tendency for people to cooperate, trust, be altruistic, even when the strategic option in that on-the-ground circumstance would be to not do so, based on the short-run features of the environment, some people look at that and make the hypothesis that that's an adaptation for solving a group-level phenomenon. And they call that, for example, strong reciprocity. Mm-hmm. I favor a view, partially likely due to my own priors on the way that the mind works and the way that natural selection is operated, but also because of evidence that I'm compelled by, that phenomenon is better accounted for by a different explanation. That you can imagine that trait being a solution to a different adaptive problem. Mm-hmm. And so when we're in this kind of situation where a single trait or a single set of traits, set of phenomenon, are potentially explained by more than one adaptationist theory, the task is to do the science of it, right? And so the perspective that I apply into this kind of question is the adaptationist framework.
Okay.
Following George Williams, we consider adaptation to be an onerous concept, that it is not something that you would want to apply in the absence of good evidence that compels you to apply it. Yeah. That we expect lots of things to occur in nature merely by stochastic random forces. Mm-hmm. But reliably complex design compels you to consider the force that designed it. And that if you see a collection of design features for solving an adaptive problem, that is special evidence that the selective pressure that caused that organization was solving that adaptive problem. And so the way to arbitrate between two alternative adaptationist theories is to evaluate them on the basis of which design features they're successfully able to predict. Mm-hmm. So looking at kind of the two defining characteristics of strong reciprocity, strong reciprocators cooperate even when there's no certain future where other people won't be cooperating with them. And they punish even when they punish bad behavior, they punish norm violation or cheating, even when they're not specifically going to be the ones that benefit from rehabilitating the other person's behavior. Maybe other people will benefit from that as well. And previous analyses have taken this constellation of behaviors, seemingly irrational cooperation, seemingly irrational punishment, analyze that irrationality at the level of individual interests, and argued that that doesn't seem to fit well individual interests. And by process of elimination, instead use that evidence to support a group-selected strong reciprocity view. In my research, I've attempted to attack that problem by making more sophisticated predictions about what the design features that would be expected from an individually selected or individually self-interested mechanism. So in the introduction that you gave me, one of the lines included how features of the ancestral ecology explain features of our modern day psychology. And one of the features of the ecology that I found particularly compelling is uncertainty. In contrast to many experiments that have elicited participant human behavior to test whether it's rationally cooperative or irrationally cooperative, in those experiments, the experimenter can make a situation be anonymous. And they can make the situation only happen once and then tell the people to go home afterwards. Mm-hmm. But in the natural world, we never engage in situations that have that much certainty. Or there's actually a distribution of situations where we have some certainty, maybe not all that much certainty. Maybe there's a few that we're very certain of, but there's many that we're not. And the question is, what are the kinds of uncertainty that you can have? And given that those kinds of uncertainty are there, what is a heuristically optimal strategy that would be selected by a process like a social evolutionary process to extract benefits from that kind of uncertain world? And it didn't really take much work to see how that consideration would allow you to get to something like irrational cooperation. Because, for instance, if I interact with you and we don't have much of a history of interaction, I don't know much about you. I don't know exactly what you specialize in. I don't know what your hidden talents might be. I don't know what the structure of the world is that might increase our likelihood of seeing each other in the future. If we have a psychology that at least holds the possibility that long-term interactions can be highly profitable, it's possible that our psychology is designed to take bets. Try to cultivate a long-term relationship just to leave that possibility open. The idea is that even if that effort ends up being wasted, that's a lower cost error than the error of missing out on a relationship that you could have had. That's the general idea. And you can imagine modeling that in many different ways. But the general perspective is that in a world with uncertainty, where the long-term benefits of life for humans are mostly acquired through social relationships, missing out on potentially lucrative social relationships is a bad idea. And little things like being a little bit nicer than you have to be, especially if there's a chance that somebody else is watching. I mean, you might be cultivating a relationship with the person you're being nice to. You could also be cultivating a relationship with the person watching you be nice to that person. So there's all kinds of uncertainty that could be shaping our propensity to be nice, even in this short-run situation where it doesn't seem strategically warranted. Similarly, a person who is mean, a person who defects or aggresses, violates a norm of social behavior against one person, demonstrates a capacity, demonstrates a tendency to engage in that kind of behavior. Whatever caused them to do it in that circumstance suggests there's a better than zero chance that they would do it in another, for example, when it involved you. Yeah. And if you punish them, you're taking the opportunity to tell them, I won't stand for you treating me that way. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, if you don't punish them, you're sort of sending them the signal, I would be okay with you treating me that way. There's at least some ways that that signal could be being sent. And so if you imagine our mechanisms are designed for a world of uncertainty, where you have uncertainty about whether you're going to see the bad actor again. You have uncertainty over what the bad actor is thinking, what the bad actor is thinking about what you're thinking, then there seems to be more than enough rationality, ecological rationality, in punishing their behavior, even if their behavior in the short run didn't really have anything to do with you. And so from this kind of analysis, it suggests to me that there's at least a possibility that what looks to some as strong reciprocity that was designed by group selection is actually not a group selected psychology at all. It's just the kind of mechanism you would expect a general process of social evolution for individual benefits that would evolve in a world that contained these kinds of dimensions of uncertainty. And I could talk to you about some results that I've collected that kind of substantiate that this seems to be the way the mind works.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I will ask you about that, but let me just ask you this first. So this kind of reaction or algorithm that we have operating in our minds to deal with uncertainty, the fact that, as you said, I guess we are predisposed to being a little bit nicer than would be expected when interacting with people, even if it's just a one-shot interaction, right? I mean, that was favored because we evolved in circumstances where, for the most part, we would be interacting more or less regularly with the same people. And so even if in one instance we had just a one-shot interaction with a person, it was highly probable that that person would play some sort of role later on. I mean, do you understand what I'm asking? Because nowadays we live in a very different world, right? Where we move around a lot and we interact with anonymous people most of the time. And I mean, maybe I was just wondering, maybe if we lived or evolved in this kind of world, if that default mechanism, let's say, of being nicer than expected would have evolved, because I mean, just due to probabilities, right? Because it would be much highly probable that we would never again interact with a person, let's say.
That's a great question, and it's a very common way of thinking that has been represented in this literature for a lot of years. From my perspective, I don't think that it's really the base rates of one-shot versus repeated interactions that actually matter. To take an analogy, in Tinder or in online dating, the volume of people that you can encounter and choose between has skyrocketed compared to the world of, having to date in bars or however people used to date. But that hasn't changed the asymmetry between the possibility of a relationship really working out and missing out on the chance of a relationship really working out, and, the small cost of going out on a date with someone who doesn't work out. If you imagine that most of the time, the effort that we expend to be irrationally nice is relatively small, like holding a door for a stranger, leaving a tip at a restaurant when we have no intention of ever going back to that restaurant again, in an online experiment, sharing a little bit of money. These kinds of the sentiments that you would have in your head that caused that kind of generosity is not engaging in a terrific amount of cost. Mm-hmm. And in a world in which most of the interactions you have are going to be one shot, even if you aggregate those costs over many, many fleeting interactions, the aggregate is still not going to be that much, potentially. And the important question is, how does that aggregate cost compare to the possibility of making a mistake on the other side? So the whole point of online dating is to find the partner, right? For some people. The point of social, dating, if you want to call it that, is to figure out who's going to be a good friend. Having a good friend who's there reliably for you can be incredibly valuable. And if you weigh the error of failing to acquire that friendship against the aggregate costs of being nice to many strangers, I think there's plenty of circumstances in human evolution where the error of not being nice was higher. Mm-hmm. And so it's not simply about the proportion of times that you're going to make one kind of error versus the other kind of error. To my mind, I think it has to be at least co-determined by, and potentially my assumption is that this dimension is going to be more predictive, more responsible for more variance in the mechanism. The variation between the cost of the error of missing out on a relationship versus the cost of the error of being nice when you didn't have to be. Now, thinking about how those parameters could have shifted between the ancestral world and the modern world, on the first kind of analysis, we certainly have many more opportunities for fleeting interactions in the modern world than we did in the ancestral past. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, the opportunities for gains in trade are much more lucrative in the modern world than they were in the ancestral past.
I understand. Yeah.
And so if you think about what are the actual levers on our mechanisms that calibrate our propensity to be irrationally nice, it's possible that the levers are being pulled to be nicer in the modern world because of these increased opportunities for gains in trade.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because you are referring to, for instance, the fact that we every day have to interact with people with whom we don't have any sort of intimate relationship, like, for example, a friendship or a romantic partnership. But on the other end, we have a lot to gain from those kinds of interactions, like when you go to the store and you buy something from a probably anonymous person that is there working or something like that, right?
Exactly. So our ability to exchange our labor for money and our money for grocery items gives us a much bigger gain in trade than our ancestors experienced. The market has given us so much opportunities to create value that being nice in order to acquire that value, opportunities for that value, like that seems very likely to plug into an ancestral ecology, to plug into a mechanism designed for an ancestral ecology that would actually leverage us into being more nice. So it's not that you have to be explicitly entertaining the possibility that you're going to be friends with the checkout cashier. But the experience of the world of, as you move throughout it, there's all of these gains in trade that are lucrative. There are people who, you meet somebody in your class, and some people who met somebody the people who met Mark Zuckerberg in their class who ended up becoming part of the Facebook enterprise, right? That was a very lucrative friendship to have formed. Sometimes you meet a friend and one of their friends becomes your mate. Sometimes you meet a friend and when you're really down on your luck, that's a person that's going to help you out. Yeah. And so there's all kinds of ways in which social relationships can be potentially very lucrative. And my expectation is that our psychology is sensitive to this potential. And when it experiences this potential, it is calibrated to be nicer.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I understand. So let me now ask you about this. I've already referred to it briefly when I talked about the work by Dr. Wrangham, and you gave us some examples where things like punishment apply in people's lives and where they have an important role to play. So in terms of vengeance and punishment, and the traits that we nowadays in our modern moral environment, let's say, would consider negative, what would you say are maybe some of the most important social roles that they play in our lives?
So I think that in the menu of choices of dynamics of social evolution, there's a few that allow punitive activities in order to increase the benefits that individuals get. So one of the most fundamental ones is bargaining. So if we have a conflict of interests, there's a resource that we both want. We can't both have it. If we have the ability to inflict costs on each other, then there's actually an equilibrium solution to who should get it. If I want it more than you, I'm willing to pay more to fight you for it. Mm-hmm. Because I'm willing to pay more to fight you for it, you will stop fighting before I will. And therefore, you're better off just giving it to me. On the other hand, if we both value it relatively the same, but you're more able to, you can inflict costs more cheaply than I can, then you will be able to impose costs on me such that I reach the point where the resource is no longer valuable compared to the cost of the fight that I put in quicker than I would to you. And therefore, I should not even put in the effort of the fight. I should just give it to you. This is the analysis that's known as the asymmetric war of attrition. And it's a model that's been applied to species broadly to understand how conflicts of interests over resource division can be decided even in the absence of fighting, as long as organisms are paying attention to differential value and differential formidability. It also explains in circumstances where you don't have perfect access to formidability, I might not know exactly how strong you are or how skilled at fighting you are, how systems of ritualized aggression, where we slowly escalate the costs that we're putting into the fight so that we each have a better sense of what the fighting potential is before we commit all the way, would allow the strategy that did that sort of thing would avoid the costs of all-out fighting and still allow organisms to get resources when they ought to. So this kind of bargaining is a common problem. And we expect it to happen in all kinds of circumstances. There's going to be cases where you value a resource more than I think you do. Mm-hmm. And I might take it and make you mad. And I might have taken it not because I didn't value you highly enough or think that you were strong enough, but because I misestimated how much you wanted it. If I keep doing that kind of thing, that's bad for you in the long term. A strategy that recalibrated me, convinced me not to do that again, would be advantageous. And so this kind of bargaining mechanism where we argue with each other, where we express anger or aggression to convince others that we're tough enough to get our way, that we care enough about things that they should give us our way without even fighting about them, that they should value us more than they did. Those kinds of mechanisms, or a mechanism that was sensitive to those features, it's really easy to see how natural selection would craft that into our psychology. And so we can think about the problems of conflicts of interest between individuals and see how aggression arguing, anger is a useful adaptation for solving those kinds of problems. Now, conflicts of interest can happen not merely between two individuals, but they can happen between groups of individuals. We might have a resource that group could have instead, or we might be inflicting costs on them by virtue of our activity that they would prefer us not to do. And the same kind of bargaining dynamic can happen between groups as happens between individuals. And so thinking about something like an act of terrorism that demonstrates we have the capacity to inflict costs on you, we're stronger than you think we are, or a mob or a protest, we have numbers that you didn't think we had. That demonstrates information that's useful in bargaining for better treatment. And so we can use the same kind of model to understand phenomenon from inter-individual aggression, punitiveness, vengeance, to intergroup aggression, terroristic violence, hate crimes, warfare.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let me ask you now about, and this is related to the sorts of questions that we've been talking about the evolution of honesty in humans in this case, because I guess that from a certain perspective at least, and the ways by which we usually think about how natural selection goes about, that it would be extremely beneficial in a lot of circumstances to be deceptive, right? Because the payoffs are more immediate, and sometimes it's really hard for people to notice after the fact that we were really dishonest. So, I mean, what would you say were the kinds of pressures that led us to evolve I'm not sure if we are really highly honest or not, but maybe from an evolutionary perspective we are. So what would you have to say about that?
So that's a fantastic question. And it's a question that you have to answer in many different domains of thinking about organismic interaction. There's sometimes when two organisms have the same interests, and the game they play is purely cooperative, and their payoffs are mutually maximized. My payoffs are maximized when your payoffs are maximized. In those circumstances, the solution is honesty. There's no payoff to being dishonest. But that's probably the minority of cases. There's probably many more cases where our interests are not perfectly overlapping, where my payoffs can be maximized to a certain extent at the expense of yours. That's a situation where there's the opportunity for dishonesty. Of course, if there's the opportunity for dishonesty in one partner, there's also the opportunity for suspiciousness in the other partner. Mm-hmm. And so this is a question of signal credulity and what kinds of signals would be credible to observers. We should expect, for example, that we shouldn't believe anybody's cheap display of toughness. We should at least be suspicious that they're not actually as tough as they say they are. But we should be relatively more credulous of a kind of costlier display of toughness, or a display of costness that they wouldn't be able to do if they weren't actually tough enough to do it. Mm-hmm. So this kind of honest signaling or costly signaling has been modeled quite a bit in the realm of theoretical biology. And one kind of consensus view on how these signals kind of evolve is when there's an equilibrium of sending the signal when you have the underlying information is true. So if it's cheaper to send the information when it's true, then to send the information when it's false, then the signal conveys information. And so we should prefer signals that have that type, and we should be more motivated to send signals that have that type when we actually want to convince people. And so that suggests that, for example, in all kinds of antagonistic interactions, there are some bargaining tactics that would not work or wouldn't work reliably well. Maybe they'll work sometimes. And then there are other tactics that work better, reliably more often at the time.
So, I mean, this is also where we get into the importance of reputation in human societies, right? Because there are several, let's say, counter mechanisms to deception that people have evolved, like, for example, the fact that we like so much to gossip about other people and things like that. And so, I mean, that's another aspect of how we get to be treated by other people and the extent to which they trust us more or less. That is the social reputation that we hold, right?
That's right. So we benefit from our embeddedness in a social world in many ways. If I'm a source of high quality, valuable information, I'm a good kind of person to keep around. You might throw me benefits every once in a while in order to keep access to my steady stream of good information. If I start giving bad information, I've communicated to you that maybe our interests are not so aligned. I've communicated to you, maybe I don't have the capacity to have good quality information. Maybe my sources aren't as good. Now, it's not so much in your interest to keep me around. And so from that perspective, maintaining your reputation as an honest signaler it's a valuable resource. It's an asset for individuals that you should expect people to judiciously cultivate.
Okay, so I mean, let me just ask you one last question, and I guess that this also connects with things like punishment and vengeance. So in our human societies, we have deterrence mechanisms, right? Or what we call deterrence mechanisms, that is to try to prevent people from doing things that harm others, for example, or harm the group. So what are the sorts of things that would fall under the rubric of deterrence in human societies? And I mean, I don't know if you want to go through some of the evolutionary processes that led to them, because we've already talked about that specifically applied to certain mechanisms, but could you tell us about that?
Absolutely. So deterrence is a concept used by lots of different kinds of scientists, social scientists, political scientists, economists. And people use it in different ways to mean different specific kinds of things. I think a compelling container for thinking about like what is a deterrence mechanism and how it might differ from other kinds of somewhat similar but not completely similar processes is imagining the mechanism that you would need to control someone's behavior when your interests were not otherwise aligned. So, for example, if we don't have a long-term relationship where we have the potential for gains in trade, but we have the capacity to harm each other, then all I'm interested in is deterring you from harming me, and all you're interested in is deterring me from harming you. And we can reach a peace treaty of not harming each other that is maintained by our ability to harm each other if that peace treaty is violated. That kind of situation is modeled as like mutually assured destruction in the case of like international relations. And we can think of that as similarly applying to a case where we have the capacity to kill each other. That's something that individual humans have the capacity to do. And if I have, a friend who will kill you if you kill me, then we have mutually assured destruction on each other, basically. Now, if the only thing that's deterring you from mistreating me is my capacity to mistreat you, then the minute that I don't have that capacity, I'm vulnerable. And so on the one hand, deterrence can be effective, but it's vulnerable to de-escalation. If I demolish my arms, I no longer have the capacity for deterrence, and so mutually assured destruction no longer applies. Mm-hmm. And so in a kind of relationship where there's no overlapping interests, deterrence can be effective, but it may not be the best strategy for a different kind of relationship. So imagine a relationship where you and I have shared interests. Maybe we're part of the same group, such that we both want the group to continue. Maybe we both value some resource out in the world and we both want to see it continue. We want it to be cultivated and not destroyed. Or maybe we are cooperative partners. We want to keep each other around because we're a source of benefits for each other. Now, that's a situation where we can actually have more access to benefits by treating each other well. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean that we're not going to have fights, right? We have fights with our spouses, with our girlfriends and boyfriends, with our families, and our friends all the time. And what these fights are about often are just exactly how the standard of treatment is going to be calibrated. Are you going to treat me this well, or are you going to treat me that well? You did something that suggested to me that you weren't thinking of me very much, and I want you to think about me more. That's the kind of thing that we tend to fight over, right? Yeah. But the thing that maintains you and your friend treating each other nicely is not your ability to destroy each other. It's your ability to provide benefits to each other. It's the benefits that you represent to each other. And you don't have to maintain arms in order to bargain for better treatment. What you could do instead is withhold benefits. If you're not as good of a friend to me as I want you to be, well, maybe our friendship is not here, maybe our friendship is here. Yeah. And if the other person wants to maintain the friendship, they need to apologize. They need to say, I promise I'll do better in the future. And that keeps the benefits going. So we can have bargaining, we can have recalibration of a relationship that works very differently than the deterrence of bad treatment, even though in both cases what you're setting is a standard of treatment. But in one case, we're doing it through coercive ability, and another, we're doing it through the capacity to create benefits. And so I think that it's important to think about conflicts of interest differently in these two different circumstances. Mm-hmm. Did that make sense?
Yes, it made sense. But so, I mean, when it comes to deterrence mechanisms, we have to evaluate them when it comes to, for example, a dyadic relationship. That is how I try to deter another person from harming me in some way, but we can also expand it to include other people and groups, right?
That's right. Yeah. So you can imagine the case that model of deterrence can be applied to two individuals, or it can be applied to two groups, or an individual and a group. Mm-hmm. The unifying factor, to my mind, is that the interests are antagonistic, that it's a zero-sum relationship between the two of them, that the thing that's maintaining a high standard of treatment is the ability of the other party to coerce it.
Okay, I understand. Okay, so Dr. Krasnow, before we go, we went through some of these topics regarding human sociality. Would you like to add something else about what we talked about? Some last message or note that of something that we left out here, or?
I think we talked about quite a bit, and often there's only so many things that
Yeah.
so many new ideas that you can absorb in any one chunk. So I think chunking is a good idea. But I would just encourage anybody watching this video to think about these issues, and if you get intrigued by them, think about the potential for our psychology to operate in many different kinds of ecologies. That the world that humans have inhabited and that the niche that we've managed to exploit across our evolution has involved many different kinds of ecologies. And think about the kind of mechanism that could create the right strategy, could result often enough in the right strategy in these different kinds of ecologies, and how that mechanism would actually achieve that feat. What kinds of information would it have to be sensitive to calibrate itself in the right way? Or what's the kind of feedback process that would take you from engaging in one kind of behavior in one ecology and another kind of behavior in another ecology? I think that thinking about those two kinds of, you might think of that as plasticity or developmental or ontological or phylogenetic change, thinking about those two mechanisms will probably get us towards a much better understanding of human behavior.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. And if people are interested and want to learn a little bit more about your work, where can people find it on the internet?
Yeah, I'm Googleable. So my laboratory website currently is at projects.iq.harvard.edu /EPL, stands for Evolutionary Psychology Laboratory. You can find me on Google Scholar. I have a Google Scholar page. All of my papers are available on my website.
Okay, great. So I will be leaving all of that in the description box of the interview so that people can go and check it out. It's very interesting. And Dr. Krasnow, again, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show, and I really loved the conversation. So thank you for taking the time.
My pleasure, Ricardo. Thanks for having me.
Hello everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. So to keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. Any amount, even just $1, would already be a great help. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons and PayPal supporters: Karen Litska, Anne Blanchett, Perelga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Chantel Gelinas, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Brian Rivera, Lucas Stafiniak, Sergio Condriano, Jane Henninen, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, John Connors, Adam Castle, Vega Guidi, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, David Diaz, Annie Ancata, Jacob Klinkby, Dr. Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, and Bo Weingart. My three producers, Izar Weber, Rosie, and Jim Frank, and my executive producer, Mikhail Ruzieski. Thank you for all.